1771. The Thames docks. A legal document is raced down to a ship that is about to set sail with its cargo for Jamaica. The document required the ship's captain to produce his cargo before the Chief Justice. The document was a writ of habeas corpus. The cargo, a slave called James Somerset. By putting Somerset in chains, the ship's captain had become his jailer, answerable to the law. Habeas corpus gives a prisoner the power to compel his jailer to justify his detention. A realization swept across the slave trade. The very legality of slavery itself was going to be tested in court. So who was James Somerset, and how had he come to be here? I asked Arthur Torrington, who has studied the history of slavery.
I suppose cousin. James Somerset was kidnapped and taken to Virginia. He was bought by a gentleman by the name of Charles Stewart. A boy of 9, enslaved, was just a page boy, was just a helper. But eventually, about 10 or so years after, this Mr. Stewart brought him to London. And that's when all the things began to change.
James Somerset escaped. Frightened and in a strange land, he sought refuge in London's 15,000-strong black community. And when the leading slavery abolitionist Granville Sharp heard of Somerset's plight, he knew he had found the perfect case with which to test the very legality of slavery.
In the case of Granville Sharp, he felt that these are human, and therefore these are human beings that cannot be and should not be treated in that particular way, in which they are enslaved, they are not given human rights, and so on. So Sharp was determined to break that cycle if he could.
This was an argument about whether a slave had rights on British soil. Did the law regard slaves as property? If so, a writ of habeas corpus would be meaningless. Or would the law see slaves as human beings? If so, habeas corpus could challenge their transportation out of the country. Ultimately, the judgment in this case would reverberate across the entire slave trade on both sides of the Atlantic. The case went to the very top, to Lord Mansfield. The slave traders could have expected Mansfield to be their ally. Of Scottish noble birth, he embodied the establishment. From his imposing home, Kenwood House, to his rulings embracing free trade, he had been prominent in both houses of Parliament and was the highest judge in the land, Lord Chief Justice. As the case ground on in Westminster Hall, Lord Mansfield is said to have proclaimed, "Let justice be done, though the heavens fall." Both sides were well represented. The abolitionist barristers claimed that there was no law legalizing slavery in this country, and so it must be illegal. The Slavers' Council countered by saying that as contracts for the sale of slaves were recognized in English law, that must validate slavery in England. The court adjourned for Lord Mansfield to prepare his judgment. Mansfield brooded over the case. What did the law say? What did his heart say? What impact would a ruling on the James Somerset case have? Granville Sharp, the great abolitionist, was anxiously awaiting the ruling. But having clashed with Mansfield in the past, he didn't come to court to avoid antagonizing the judge. So he didn't hear the judgment delivered, staying instead at his home. The result was sprinted through the streets to him. In this street, somewhere near that spot, Granville Sharp answered his door. There in front of him, smiling, exultant, stood James Somerset, a free man. In his judgment, Lord Mansfield said that the state of slavery is of such a nature, so odious, that the English common law could never accept it. Now, whether he meant by this to ignite a spark that would end slavery is unclear, but that is how his judgment was interpreted both here and abroad. One single writ of habeas corpus had released not just one man from bondage, but was to mark the start of freedom for all the 15,000 slaves then in England.